Hello everyone and welcome back to the FSR Policy Briefcase with me, James Kneebone.
And me, Leonardo Meus.
We're very happy to welcome to the show today Lee Hansche, who is professor at Tilburg University and part-time professor here at the Florence School of Regulation, where she is head of the Energy Union Law area. Lee's work largely focuses on energy market regulation, EU state aid, and energy market governance. So thanks very much for joining us, Lee.
Thank you very much to both of you for the kind invitation.
Of course. So today's paper, Leveraging the Energy Transition, the Role of Long-Term Contracts, that you recently wrote together with Guillaume Desaubry, has broad policy implications, and that will be the main focus of today's discussion, as after all, we are the policy briefcase. Nevertheless, it is of course still quite legalistic and technical at points, as you would expect. So we'll try in general to avoid using acronyms and jargon, but for the benefit of the listeners, would you be able to clarify some of the key terminology? So perhaps starting with a loose definition of long-term contracts, or LTCs, as you may hear them referred to in the electricity sector, the difference between public and private long-term contracts, as well as the relevance of Articles 101 and 102 from the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, or TFEU, to these kind of contractual agreements.
Let's start then with the definitions of a long-term contract. As we say in the study, in the report, you can't find any legal definitions of these concepts. So there's nothing in any article of the treaty or even in any regulation or delegated regulation that will give you the definition of what is long-term. So really anything that's not spot could be long-term, although normally today we would think of anything over 2 years to be long-term.
Okay.
Turning to your second question, the difference between the public and the private long-term contract. Again, this is a distinction that we have introduced. It does have legal significance because what we're trying to explain is that a public long-term contract will usually be one that's concluded with a public organization or authority, a state authority, and that could mean that certain types of contracts where you have, as with contracts for differences, a strike price that is guaranteed by a government authority, that could have legal implications under the state aid rules. Whereas private long-term contracts do not involve any state organization as a counterparty. So we dub them private or commercial.
So that would be an agreement between a consumer and an off-taker directly with,
yes,
just on an agreed price and duration.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the price is commercially negotiated. Yeah. And then the third one, on the relevance of the Articles 101 and 102 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. Again, these don't raise any direct definitions that we have to deal with. Article 101 prohibits companies concluding what we call restrictive agreements. So Article 101 deals with contracts which could be horizontal between two competitors or more, and vertical, so between, let's say, a large producer and a large off-taker. So that 101 deals with that. And 102, which is sort of the sister article, deals with abuse of a dominant position. And that's very relevant here as well.
Yeah.
So
okay.
those are the terms, perhaps, that it's useful to have clarified.
Yeah, I think I'm next because I tried to read the report very well, Lee. It's a really interesting legal analysis. There is also the economic perspective of our colleague Jean-Michel Glachon together with Emma, but I'll focus on the legal part because that was also for me as a non-legal expert the most new part. So I'll try to say in my words what I understood, and then I have a few questions for you, Lee. So first of all, my understanding is that we have not really allowed utilities to sign long-term contracts with their customers. Why? Because when we were starting this whole liberalization project, when we were setting up markets, We were worried that long-term contracts would be a way of utilities that were often in a dominant or even super dominant position to lock in their customers. And the only way for a new company to enter into the market would be to have contracts with existing customers, right? So we didn't want existing customers to be locked in. But in a way, the context has changed because today, as I understand, also from a legal perspective, it matters that the market is growing. If we really go for electrification, if some industries electrify, the market could grow. Maybe even utilities co-invest with their customers. And maybe then from a legal point of view, we are also in a different type of situation. And then also, because if markets, meanwhile, the short-term markets are working, maybe there is more space for long-term contracts. And then very interesting, I found this fact that you are a bit worried that if we don't do anything, if we leave things as they currently are, maybe we are sort of one unintended consequence of the current setup is that maybe public contracts, long-term contracts, are easier to get clearance from than private contracts, while we want private contracts. So maybe from a legal point of view that we created a kind of implicit bias, which is a bit unfortunate given that public budgets are limited and that we want to have private investments. And then also towards the end of the study, you enter into really concrete examples where you again say there is no definition of long-term contracts, but there seem to be at least different type of contracts. And you give the example of what you call a power purchase agreement that is more asset specific, right? Or you say some contracts is more about risk sharing, or some contracts are what we could call purely supply contracts. And maybe we should be not necessarily have the same worries on each type of contract. And then you basically ask that maybe there could be some clarification around that, where you already gave an interpretation, but you say maybe some of these things that we indicate could be confirmed or clarified. And now my three questions are to elaborate also on this. So the first question is to go back in time, because you discuss cases, no, that sort of set the scene of the hostility, you could say, against long-term contracts. And you mentioned the case of Distrigas, and I think also a case on EDF. Could you tell us a bit more, the basics of those cases?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Yes, thanks for your clarifications there on how the report has been developed, and indeed this problem that we might face, that there are these rather perverse incentives in the way the public versus the private contracts are being treated. So in the old world, where we applied competition law at the time of market liberalization, electricity market opening, the concern was to make sure that if you were trying to split up functions within the big state incumbents, the big utilities, then you didn't really want them to replicate their hold over the market through contracts. So, of course, we didn't unbundle the production function out of the large companies. We unbundled transmission. But to make sure that new entrants could indeed penetrate the newly liberalized markets, it was important that you didn't allow that same monopolistic structure to be replicated through contracts. So that's why, if you look back to the early 2000s, so this is at the time, we've just had the first wave of regulation, the first package, which of course was fairly mild in terms of unbundling, but took away exclusive rights of imports and tried to open up the market gradually. And so the Commission was concerned then that process wouldn't be frustrated through these long-term contracts. And that's why the Commission then investigated several cases, but two that are really important. One in the gas sector, Distrigas, and one in electricity is EDF. And they looked at the terms of the contracts, the duration of the contracts, the nature of those contracts, and they reached what we call in legal terms commitments with both of these companies. So commitments are legally binding on the companies, of course, but they're usually offered by the companies after a formal investigation by the Commission, and the Commission tests the market with the proposed commitments. And that means that the companies then enter, as it were, a deal with the Commission in exchange for not having to pay a fine. So in the case of Distrigas then, the Distrigas entered into commitments for a period of 4 years, and EDF for a period of 10 years. And the commitments, we summarise them in the report, but basically what's really important was to avoid what we call in competition law terms, and also competition policy, the foreclosure of the market. Contracts of over 2 years, or in the case of EDF, 5 years, they had to be then automatically amended or just, renegotiated. And also the coverage of those contracts had to be limited to 50% of the market. So the companies were allowed to conclude contracts for short duration, but only also for a limited part of the market.
Okay, very interesting. On the second aspect, on this bias, could you explain us a bit more? Like, is it not enough to say, okay, we need private long-term contracts, there is a more positive attitude to them in general, or why is this, from a legal point of view, still problematic?
Right, so what we try to explain in the report is with public long-term contracts, because the state aid rules apply, right? If a government fixes the strike price, even if it's a two-way contract for difference, and the government might get money back if the prices in fact drop. There's still, in strict legal terms, state aid, because you're giving those companies something that they couldn't have concluded on the market. So that's why they conclude them with public authorities. And we have quite clear rules now about the terms of those contracts that the Commission will deem to be acceptable. And those are under the state aid rules, Articles 107, 108 of the treaty, but the Commission has produced guidelines, quite extensive guidelines, and they're quite recent on energy environmental guidance in 2022. And these have also been updated because we have various temporary and transitional crisis frameworks to deal with the energy crisis. So those contracts are encouraged within that framework. And again, the Commission gives guidance. Plus, we have what we call general block exemption regulations. So you don't actually have to notify the Commission of certain deals, maybe of a lower value. So you know that those are fine, they shouldn't be challenged. And then we have individual decisions. So the most important one that has just been adopted concerns the construction of a nuclear power plant in the Czech Republic, where the Czechs had asked the Commission for clearance for a contract for 60 years. And I believe they've been allowed a contract for 40 years. But they know, everybody knows where they are in advance because we have a decision from the Commission. With these private contracts, we don't have that guidance ex ante. And this is the big difference. You could have some ex post enforcement, Commission level, also at national level. Obviously, we have national competition authorities, but with state aid, it's all ex ante.
Yeah, and that's what you try to also enter into in the last part of the report with
Yes.
these 3 contracts, where
Yes.
you say maybe some things on what is allowed and not allowed for different type of contracts could be confirmed and clarified.
Yes.
Could you give us an example of that?
Sure, yes. So we're coming from the old world where we have these commitments that were given in this Distrigas case and the EDF case, which you mentioned. And that's really the only guidance that we have, of what's not allowed. But those commitments have expired. So we don't even know if the Commission was to look at the problem again today, if the Commission would come to the same conclusions. And it's quite unusual for the Commission to do anything so concrete these days. So what we've suggested in the paper is, well, obviously it's important to stress here, no size fits. There's no one size fits all. So we've tried to come up with 3 broad categories of contract where we think it would be important for the Commission to give a little bit more guidance to investors. Because obviously the whole purpose of this exercise is to unlock more private financing, which we desperately need, as you said yourself. There's not enough public money to go around. So to give more legal stability and predictability to these private contracts, we've looked at three categories. So the first is, it's kind of aligned to what we call a PPA, a power purchase agreement. Now, all these contracts can be extremely sophisticated and complex, but we're looking at PPAs that are attached to investment, to new investment. And we do have guidance. You can find a bit of guidance from the Commission in the new market design regulation, for example, in some of the renewable energy regulations on PPAs for renewables. And there you could say, well, one can safely assume that the duration of the contract will not be problematic as long as it's related to the depreciation of the asset. So that's why, going back to that recent Czech case, also 40 years was seen to be reasonable because that would depreciate the nuclear asset. So with PPAs, then, there is quite a bit of guidance out there. Even the old EDF commitments allowed for new investment. The contracts could be of a longer duration. But that, at the time, wasn't particularly important because there was no new investment at that time. We had more or less overcapacity. We had mature markets. With renewables, of course, we have to have a lot of new capacity, but we'll also have to have baseload until we get storage on a large scale. Baseload will be hydro, it will be nuclear. We will still need new investments there, or we need to retrofit. So we think that in that category, the sort of general PPA category, there shouldn't really be big issues, but it would be good for the Commission to come with some clarification and confirmation that what we're saying makes sense. And then the next category, the risk sharing, well, here you see examples of longer term contracts where you're not so much tying customers to new investment, but because we're really trying to push decarbonisation in a much more urgent context, and we have companies that are now, required to come up with ESG targets, and these targets are binding. So large energy users will need to be able to show that they can actually acquire electricity that is green at a stable price over a long duration. So that's a kind of risk sharing on the side of the consumer, the larger consumer. But of course, for the producers, there's also risk sharing. They have to be able to get rid of the stuff. So it's that, I think, also in the new context where we're looking at markets that are more demand driven, and we have these extra ESG requirements, that these types of contracts become much more important. And here we have very little guidance that we can, find in district gas and EDF, because it's really a new context. And then the final category is, as you said yourself, this is just a shorter term supply contract. And the thing that's probably driving the need for clarification there is that the Commission itself says, we should allow ordinary consumers, even consumers like us, or maybe prosumers or cooperatives, to hedge. And you will need access to these type of contracts to hedge. And again, it's maybe difficult for companies in a dominant position having a dominant position, I have to stress, not problematic. It's what you do with it. But if they conclude a large number of these contracts that cover a wider part of the market, we're into this foreclosure issue again. So we need guidance on that type of contract as well.
Okay, thank you.
So
Very
those are
clear.
the three sort of categories that we're looking at. Yeah.
Thank you, Lee.
So, Lee, we're really asking you to cover a lot of ground here today,
Yeah.
but if I may, I'm really interested in the importance of long-term contracts under what you describe in the paper as a sort of new facts and realities of European competition policy. So this is versus the former liberalization process, right?
Yeah.
So we already talked a little bit about the fact that these long-term contracts were perhaps a little bit demonized for the risk of lock-in, etc. Well,
Yeah.
as you argue in the paper, there are new realities now, and I mean, I'm personally interested because our work on hydrogen, for example, is now tied up into this subject on industrial decarbonization, the transformation of economic geographies in Europe and beyond for these energy-intensive sectors, right? Where the contractual agreements, the procurement of energy is such a key variable for driving their cost and competitiveness, right? So I really liked, in particular, this paragraph, and I'd like to quote it, if you don't mind, where you say, "We argue that, unlike the first EU electricity world, the real war in today's EU is not a war with the existing electricity generators and suppliers, be they big, medium, or small, privately owned or publicly owned, incumbent or innovative fringe. It's a war with itself. The EU has to reinvent its industrial energy fundamentals and to build a strong, clean industrial base. The EU fortunately already has a working internal market, but it does not yet have these industry new fundamentals and that clean industrial base. EU today's new decarbonization, Cold War economics are just different from the successful and peaceful former liberalization process." So it seemed to me that a big part of this logic to take a serious look at revising the framing of the LTCs and to enable energy intensive industry to have stability and predictability, for example, in investing in new technology cycles that perhaps are too risky under current energy procurement conditions. Do you have an example in mind of such a sector and such a corresponding technology shift that is happening or likely to happen? And what kind of LTCs could you imagine them benefiting from?
Thank you. Well, the quote, I should acknowledge that is from Professor Glachon's accompanying report, where he, in fact, stresses that the EU should not be at war with itself, and we have to look again at the purpose of these contracts. I mentioned already the importance of being able to buy large quantities of green electricity at a stable, predictable price for the Googles of this world, who are selling their whole service as green. So they need to be able to deliver on that, and they need to be careful that they don't get caught greenwashing, which is now also it's also problematic, not just from a legal point of view, but from an image point of view. So I think there's that aspect. The other aspect is that long-term contracts provide, they're a vehicle for coordination along the value chain.
Yeah.
And so we're looking now at many industries who need access to all sorts of critical raw materials, of course. So perhaps a good illustration of sector where we're seeing a lot of investment in new technology is the aluminium sector, where obviously they have to decarbonize very urgently. I think that's also something we have to consider, so that this predictability is really important that you can get from a long-term contract to make the commitments to decarbonize that are huge and that you have to embrace really, really quickly. You can already see actually some examples in Norway, where their equivalent of the Commission, the EFTA Surveillance Authority, allows these types of contracts in the aluminium sector to make sure that you can get that decarbonisation fast.
Okay, perfect. And is that a sector that's being electrified as well? I mean, previously...
Yeah, well, you're shifting as fast as you can to green electricity.
Okay.
And using green electricity in the process.
Yeah.
So a process industry as well.
Okay.
So it's very important in that industry. And in turn, aluminium, we need for so many applications for other forms of renewable energy. So.
And it seemed during the energy crisis, for example, whilst we're speaking of these new realities of the energy sector, that on the demand side, some high energy consuming industrial sectors procuring electricity on the spot market were given additional finance from governments to be able to buy what they needed, essentially. Whilst on the supply side, others were either being paid not to consume, or likewise, those that had these sort of pre-agreed private supply contract, maybe even, underneath this threshold, you say something under 2 years, but nevertheless at an agreed price, were being given the option to sell their capacity back to the market and even being encouraged to do so. What role do you see that a revised framework for long-term contracts could have provided under those circumstances?
Well, obviously, it depends whether you're looking at it from the consumer side or the producer side. But it's all about managing price volatility. And on the consumer side, you want to limit that, I think. But you still want, I think you must still want to make sure that if the spot market price does decrease, that you still have a way of recouping that value. Whereas for the suppliers, of course, their interests are the opposite.
Yeah.
So this is where one needs then to really look at the complexities of the contract and the individual terms that will have to be developed. So duration is important. Could be 5 years, 10 years will give sufficient predictability in those contracts. But you might want to link the way prices are negotiated, spot market price, or consumer inflation index. I mean, we have, and I think that's also important to stress, in the new world, the current electricity world, we have a lot more of those indexes that you can incorporate into these contracts.
Yeah.
So you can use long-term contracts in a much more flexible way than was possible before.
Okay, so it's not just about reframing the application of long-term contracts, but maybe reframing, redefining exactly what a long-term contract can do, what it can mean, and how dynamic it can be. Yeah, I think that's an important point.
Yeah.
Right, so where apparently long-term contracts, as I understand it, do not raise antitrust concerns in principle, but are rather even incentivized. So you explain that despite this position, the cost of renewables have fallen considerably with large quantities of capacity installed. So has there been a recent change in perception of long-term contracts there, as you advocate that Europe needs now, or is this consistent with the historical view?
They've never really been an issue. Europe's been rather out on a limb when it comes to these long-term contracts. And in fact, it's also maybe important to say, the energy sector is also treated differently. So we've come from a world where long-term energy contracts have been treated in this hostile way, I think, to use Leo's words at the beginning, where, but Europe's the exception in that, and energy is the exception. So when you look at what's happening in the US, there is a very strong policy to push PPAs, especially financial PPAs. Mm-hmm. And then you have a very, very diverse market where many of the European companies are also significant players.
Because to link back to industrial policy again and make that comparison is one of the reasons I mentioned the US is because in this world, the comparisons are constantly made with the subsidies made available in the US and these different kinds of incentives and mechanisms that are being put into the framework to support different technologies to capture these clean tech sectors moving forward, to reconfigure to this new world, as you describe it. Do you feel sometimes that not enough attention is being paid to just simply the contractual arrangements that are allowed for the procurement of electricity? And sometimes we tend to fixate, perhaps because it's a bit more shiny and interesting on the face of it, on a per euro subsidy, or do you know what I mean? This kind of...
absolutely. No, I think all these factors have to be taken into account, as large firms must do if they're planning if on the consumer side, if you're planning some large distribution center where you're going to use a lot of electricity, you're going to look at how you're going to source it, and whether you can get longer term arrangements with the utilities in the area.
So something that the EU is restricted to an extent with the amount perhaps of budget that it can allocate to the Net Zero Industry Act relative to the Inflation Reduction Act to make a easy side by side. What we can do is be smart with the way we allow different, regulations and contractual agreements to emerge that can help make some of that shortfall.
Yes, yeah. We really need to move away from this sort of kind of hostility as the gut sort of reaction towards a smarter environment for allowing contracts to develop, and that's kind of the thrust of the report, giving some basic guidance as to where we could go.
Brilliant.
Great. I think we can close here. Just thanking you once again.
Okay, thank you.
For the report, for being part of our school, always bringing new ideas, this time educating us both on the legal dimension of long-term contracts. I don't know if any of you brought a long-term contract that we can sign at the end of this podcast. If not, we have to close just like this.
I have my pen ready if you're offering.
Well, if you want to sign, here.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
And I hope you will enjoy reading the report.